Okay, so we're going to get to our first keynote speaker of the morning. She is an international trade expert and a blockchain enthusiast, and she's a senior analyst at the World Trade Organization's Economic Research Department. So please give a very warm welcome to Emmanuelle Ganne.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. And yeah, it looks like it was a short night for many of you, so we'll have to make sure that we keep this session entertaining and try to bring some additional people. So I've been actually, could you please put the first slide, not the last one? This is the very last one of my presentation. So thanks. So today, I'll be talking about the role of global governmental organizations, international organizations, in promoting blockchain technology and applications. For many years, blockchain applications, proofs of concept, pilot projects have been confined to the world of the private sector. And it's only very recently that governments and international organizations have started to get excited about the technology. And they are being excited. Why? Because they see that this technology has a great potential, but that it also raises a number of regulatory challenges. And so this is what I want to talk about today. And I want to talk about what it means for governments and for international organizations, what should be their role if we want the technology to be used to its full potential. Now, this potential stems from peer-to-peer exchanges, possibility to interact without intermediaries in real time in a highly secure environment, the immutability that gives rise to additional transparency, traceability, and the trust dimension. So I said international organizations are getting excited about it. Why? Because they see that it can help implement the famous SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And I will go very briefly about a number of areas where this technology could make a difference for the SDGs. And then I'll talk more about international trade, which is really my area of focus. The SDGs were adopted in 2015. And they are basically what drives international organizations, the UN more specifically. Goal 1, for example, no poverty, eradication of the poverty. Blockchain here offers great potential to bank the unbanked. We have 2 billion people on Earth without access to the banking system. Blockchain, with cryptocurrencies, BitPesa, and others, can help them access financial services. In terms of donation as well, if you want to eradicate poverty, you can give some money to NGOs. Now it's very difficult to know where the money goes to, whether it actually reaches the intended person. There, the traceability of blockchain provides a very interesting solution. Goal 12 is about responsible consumption and production. If we go with current trends, by 2050, there will be 9.6 billion people on Earth. That means that we probably need close to 3 planet Earth if we continue living the way we live. So sustainable production, sustainable consumption is critical. And here again, blockchain can help. It can help ascertain the sustainable origin of products. There have been a number of pilot projects in this field to make sure, for example, that fish that is caught is sustainable fish, it's labor-free fish. There are a number of projects also to ascertain ethical claims, like make sure that the small farmer in a developing country gets its fair pay. This can be actually ensured through the traceability of the blockchain. Goal 13 is about climate action. There are a lot of talks about climate action these days with big demonstrations by the youngsters in the streets. Here again, the key characteristics of the technology can also help. They can help improve carbon emission trading, peer-to-peer renewable energy trading, in terms of crowdfunding, financing for climate action. So here again, a number of governments and international organizations are getting excited. Life below water, which is goal 14. I talked about fish, sustainable fishing. Goal 15, which is not underwater, it's on land. Here again, it's critical that we promote sustainable production. And one of the things that is used very often to prove that it's sustainable, it's organic, it's certification, labeling. Now, the problem with current labeling systems is that they can be very easily manipulated. And here, blockchain offers an interesting solution because of the immutability and traceability of the technology. Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And here we're actually in the perfect city to talk about that, because Zook has been a pioneer in e-voting, which is something that blockchain can actually promote and help. And financing for SDGs, I already mentioned the question of donations, traceability of funds from donor to recipient. So here it helps to provide more transparency, effectiveness, more accountability. So for all these reasons, you have a number of international organizations, UN, getting excited, and they actually created an interagency group a few months back to discuss these issues and try and coordinate action. But it can also be very powerful to make trade frictionless and paperless. Trade is very labor and paper intensive. If you want to ship avocados from Mombasa to Rotterdam, there are about 20 people involved, 20 documents to fill, 200 different interactions, but it creates a pile of paper that can be 25 centimeters high. 25 centimeters high. And then, when you look at international trade as a whole, the paper that is required to ship goods could fill 80 747 aircrafts. So it's, in a way, horrendous that we still need to use so much paper to trade internationally. And when you think about it, international trade hasn't changed that much since the invention of the container. The container did revolutionize international trade. Since then, goods are transported still in the same way as they were some 50 years ago. But blockchain could, and I just actually wrote an article on that, could, in my view, become the new container of international trade. It has the potential to make trade frictionless and paperless. As I said, international trade processes are complex, labor-intensive, and I put here a graph by the Boston Consulting Group that shows all the interactions needed for a single international trade transaction. Just look at the number of actors involved, the number of documents involved, and all the interactions. What they found out is that you have 5,000 data fields interactions that are created, but only 1% creates value. It's nothing. And this is where blockchain can be very powerful, because instead of having all these bilateral interactions between the different actors involved in international trade, you can have this interaction via a platform, exchanges on a peer-to-peer basis in a highly secure environment. You know that once the information has been added to the ledger, it's very difficult to tamper with that information, so it's immutable. You know that it's time-stamped, so you can trace very easily. So this technology brings a number of very interesting characteristics and could make trade flow much more easily and frictionless. Now, here is another example of transportation and logistics. Here again, many different actors involved: importer, exporter, shipper, carrier, customs brokers, etc. Right now, they all work in silo. What blockchain can bring is have these different actors interact directly with one another through a single platform in a highly secure environment. And so that could significantly help international trade. So as a result, the race is on. You have a number of platforms that have emerged. And here, they are the platforms that concern international trade, a number in the trade finance field, a number of them as well in transportation and logistics. I mentioned that. And you have some governments, of course, looking into it also for border procedures. So the potential is huge. It's huge in a number of areas. It could truly transform the way we do business. The internet transformed communication. Blockchain can transform the way we do business. It can transform transactions. And so B2 transactions, what really the internet was to communication. But there are a number of challenges that need to be overcome. And these are very important to bear in mind, and very important that we focus on these. If you really want the technology to make a difference, to make international trade frictionless and paperless, if you want to improve the life of people around the world. So what are these challenges? just come back to the previous slide. You saw all these different platforms in the field of international trade that have emerged. Well, many of them are actually, these platforms are built on different technologies. And I know that you're tech people, so you very well know the different types of technologies that exist. I have this problem when I have to talk to government officials and trade officials and try to explain to them what blockchain is. Well, actually, blockchain, we refer to it in a generic term, but it's more distributed ledger technologies, in plural. There are many different technologies. And what happens is that these different platforms that I've mentioned are not built on the same technology. Some, if I take trade finance platforms, some are built on the core technology, some others on Hyperledger, others on Quorum. So what do we have? We have an interoperability problem. But interoperability is a catch-all phrase, catch-all term. It can be interoperability at a technical level. And here we do have a digital island problem. These platforms do not talk to each other, not even the trade finance platform, let alone when you have to interact between trade finance and transportation and logistics. That's even more complex. Why? Because not only do you have a technical interoperability problem, even though the IT community is working on it, but you also have interoperability issues when it comes to semantics. What does it mean? Are we speaking the same language? Is a bill of lading the same thing as a manifesto? If I talk about product nomenclature, do I mean the HS nomenclature that is used by customs? Or do I mean the say to contain that is used by shippers? We don't speak the same language. Now, some organizations, international organizations, and we'll come back to it later, are working on that, and they have developed libraries of semantics. But this aspect is critical, because if we want to connect the dots, if we want the technology to work to its full potential, if we want it to break silos, and I do believe that it's a technology that can break silos, we need to make sure that we speak the same language. We need to make sure that the data models are aligned. We need to make sure that the processes are aligned. And for the time being, they're not. So you have all these projects that emerge in different areas, but they emerge in silo. And so if there's one message that I want to pass on, is the importance of all working together and trying to break these silos and not reproduce them at another level. And I will come back to it later. Regulatory issues. I know there are a couple of panels after this talk on regulation. So I will briefly touch upon these, some of the regulatory issues that are raised. But first, I know that regulation for some people in the IT field is like a bad word. And I want to say, no, not necessarily. Regulation can be an enabler. And it's very important to bear that in mind. If I take the example of international trade, we have a great technology that could digitalize trade. Brilliant. Now, what if your legislation still requires a paper copy, which is the case in most countries? The technology won't do much. The technology, after all, is just a tool. So you need to have a conducive regulatory environment to make it happen. And as a matter of fact, the UN Citral Model Law on e-signatures that was adopted in 2001 has been adopted by a bit more than 30 countries around the world. The longer-awaited UN Citral Model Law on transferable electronic records that I know many in the blockchain area were waiting for was passed in the summer of 2017. It has been adopted by one in 2 years, Bahrain. So congratulations to Bahrain for that. Just to say that there are some model laws that exist, but action hasn't been taken at the national level. So legislation can act as an enabler, but needs to be adjusted in some cases for the technology to actually make a difference and to be able to be used to its full potential. Legislation is not enough. Culture, mindsets also have to change. In some countries, the legislation has been adjusted, but the traders still require a paper copy because they're used to it. So regulation as an enabler. Recognition of e-signatures, e-documents is critical. Other issue that is being raised, smart contracts. Well, actually, they're not really contracts in the legal sense of the term. and I was moderating a panel yesterday at the WTO on IP and blockchain, and one of the first questions from a lawyer, an American lawyer in the audience, IP lawyer, was, well, what about the status of smart contracts, the legal status? We have a big issue with that. Yes, we do to a certain extent. There are ways around, yes, but this is something we may want to look into. What are smart contract dysfunctions? Which is a particular issue in the case of permissionless blockchains, not so in the case of permission blockchains where a governance structure can be put in place. What about the status of blockchain transactions? Admissibility of blockchain-based evidence. Will a court recognize the blockchain as an immutable and tamper-proof source of truth? Well, there was a very interesting case actually in China last year. The Chinese Supreme Court did recognize blockchain-based evidence as admissible. But to my knowledge, it's the only case to date. So this is something we need to look into. Will a judge consider that information stored on a ledger that proves ownership, or that is meant to prove ownership, actually, in reality, proves ownership? Will that judge consider that? Will a chain mark, which is a trademark registered on a blockchain, and there are some startups working on that, providing this service of chain marks, are they actually real trademarks? Do they offer the same level of protection? Will they be recognized in courts? These are critical issues that we need to look into if we really want the technology to become mainstream and to make a difference. Data flows. Great, blockchain is a technology that can break barriers, that is global. If you have some limitations on data flows, well, it will hinder the potential of the technology. We have some discussions on that at the WTO. Then, there are some issues regarding possible compatibility with existing laws, and I have in mind here data protection laws, the famous GDPR. When the GDPR came into force, you had all these headlines, GDPR will block blockchain. Well, no, it's more complex than that. It won't block blockchain, but it certainly does raise certain issues when it comes to the right to be forgotten and the right of erasure, even though the French CNIL acknowledged that the use of certain encryption methods combined with key destruction could actually be considered erasure. But there are a certain number of gray areas there, in particular in the case of permissionless blockchains, less so in the case of permission blockchains. And then there are a number of other regulatory challenges that this technology raise, and it's basically a jump in the unknown for many regulators. How to classify tokens, utility tokens, security tokens? Should we prohibit STOs or not? Some countries prohibit them, some countries allow them. What about cryptocurrencies? The problem we have now is that we have a regulatory fragmentation. Governments have started looking into it, but they're all looking into it pretty much in silo for the moment. There are some that are looking at it at a more regional level, especially at the EU. But there's no real coordination. So we have a risk of regulatory fragmentation, which, in my view, could really impede the development of this technology, and I think this is something we need to work on. And that brings me to the next point, which is governance. We need, in my view, some kind of governance. I know that this word, just like regulation, is not very popular among certain people in the IT community. But, well, the internet does have some governance structures. You have policy networks, you have standards network, you have delivery networks, you have advocacy networks. And for the moment, the blockchain world is pretty much the World Wide West when it comes to governance. You have some initiatives that have emerged. You have the EU Blockchain Observatory. You have the Universal Trade Network, for example, that was launched in November 2018. So we're starting to see some entities, some coordination coming up, but there's still a lot to be done. And if we want to address the regulatory challenges, some of the regulatory challenges I mentioned, because I didn't mention all of them, if we want to address the risk of regulatory fragmentation, I think we need to think about what type of governance we have. We need to put in place some structures that allow us to all advance together and work together in the same direction so that we do not recreate the silos I was mentioning a few minutes ago. And another point that, in my view, is particularly important is the lack of knowledge outside the blockchain world. I said blockchain is a very complex world. It's not one technology. So there are different types of technologies, different types of platforms, permissionless, private, public. People, I work with ambassadors and trade officials. They don't understand what it is. In most cases, actually, for them, blockchain is Bitcoin. So I think we need to do a much better job at explaining that blockchain, the technology, and when I use the term blockchain, I actually want to say DLT. I use it in the generic sense of the term. We need to do a much better job at explaining that blockchain is not equal to Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just an application of blockchain, but for many people, it's still the case. When I organized the first workshop at the WTO in November last year, it was a workshop on blockchain and international trade. I had some people come to me and say, oh, your Bitcoin conference. I said, no, actually, we're not going to talk about crypto. We're going to talk about the technology itself. So there's a lot of education to be done. It may be evident for you what blockchain is, but for people who are not in the IT sphere, who are regulators, it's a very complex world. And to understand the concepts, what it can do, is very, very hard. And I think this is something on which you, the IT community, the people involved in blockchain projects have a big role to play. There are, in my view, 3 key principles of governmental action or intergovernmental action. What I tell ambassadors, government officials, trade officials, when I talk to them is, look, I know it's a complex technology, but there's a lot happening. It's changing the world. You need to keep track of what's happening. You need to keep abreast of development, and for that, you need to educate yourself. You need to build capacity within your institution. And you need to be proactive and forward-looking. Don't wait for things to happen. Look at the potential of this technology to change the world economy. And the question of coordination, I will come back to it, which in my view is critical. We need to involve all stakeholders, and so I'm very pleased to have been invited to this conference because I know that many in the audience are from the private sector. I'm not. I work in an international organization, but I'm a blockchain enthusiast, and what I see is that we still very much work in silos, and we need to work all together if we want to make it happen. So we need a multi-stakeholder dialogue on that. And in my view, international cooperation is key if we want to avoid the regulatory fragmentation I mentioned a few minutes earlier. So what are the international coordination efforts? What do international organizations do in that area? What role are they playing? They're basically working on 3 different levels. The level of standardization, second, policy and regulatory work, and third, applications. And I've put here some global international organizations, even though the OECD is not really global, but they're doing a lot in terms of blockchain work. And the other ones are more global organizations. There are other organizations beyond those who work on blockchain, but I've focused on the truly international ones. So in terms of standardization, you have, for example, ISO and ITU working on definition issues. What I was talking a bit earlier about the semantics. What does blockchain mean? How should we categorize the different terms? Technical interoperability and smart contracts. So 2 organizations working on pretty similar issues. Luckily, they've started talking to each other and coordinating to some extent their effort. Then on semantics and data models, you have UNCFACT, which is part of the UN European Economic Commission for Europe, and you have the World Customs Organization. They have libraries of semantics, as I said. They also have their own data models. Here again, 2 organizations working on pretty similar issues. Policy and regulatory work. There is a lot of work done at the OECD on the question of taxation and cryptocurrencies. The World Customs Organization is more focused on border procedures, customs procedures, and so what the technology, what blockchain can do to improve border procedures and facilitate trade. And then at the WTO, we have the Trade Facilitation Agreement that touches also on a question of border procedures. And we have negotiations on digital trade that touch upon issues like e-signatures, e-documents, data flows, so issues that I just mentioned earlier. Then, in terms of applications, you have a number of international organizations that are actually developing some projects. So at the level of the UN, for example, you have the World Food Program that developed, that tested blockchain into refugee camps in Jordan for food vouchers, because very often they can be lost, there are problems of corruption, etc. So the idea was to better manage these vouchers. You have the World Bank that has issued a bond on a blockchain. That was actually the first bond that they issued. They raised about $60 billion in bond each year to implement their programs of economic development. And so last year, they issued a bond on a blockchain for $110 million. So that was the first. And they're doing a number of proofs of concept also here and there. They did one in Vietnam that was quite interesting for us at the WTO because it touched upon border procedures and small and medium-sized enterprises. And they have a blockchain innovation lab. So you have all these different organizations working. What I want to say to conclude this talk is that blockchain can truly have a very large and significant impact, an economic impact, a huge impact when it comes to international trade, for example. But for that, we need to develop the right policy environment. We need to develop a conducive regulatory environment. And in a way, we need to move from what I call an ecosystem to an ecosystem. We need to build that ecosystem. And this is where I believe governments and international organizations have a key role to play if we want to address the different challenges that I've mentioned, and if we want to avoid the risk of regulatory fragmentation. But there is also a key role for the private sector, for you guys, because you need to help educate regulators. You need to help raise awareness. And you need to help put in place also the right policy environment. Why? Because regulators do not necessarily, as I said, understand all the technical aspects and do not necessarily have the whole picture. So we all need, on these issues, to work hand in hand. We need to have a multi-stakeholder dialogue and a global coordination. And this is something that struck me really when I was doing my research for the book that I published last year on blockchain and international trade. So I was talking to all these different actors, and I realized that they all work in silo. And even you saw the different international organizations. You have several international organizations working on the same issues, but they don't really talk to each other. So we need to do a much better job at joining forces and working together if we really want to make a difference and to address these regulatory challenges I mentioned in a coordinated manner. So we need to work hand in hand if we want to create what I call a global asset web. And here I would like to come back to that term, global asset web. I think we have a terminology problem. Blockchain, as I said, is very often associated with Bitcoin for many people who are not very familiar with the technology. And it's a technology. And what I hope I've managed to transmit as a message is that the technology is only a tool. You need to build a proper ecosystem around it. You need to have a conducive regulatory framework if you want the technology to make a difference. So I think instead of focusing so much on the technology itself, what we should be talking about is how do we create a global asset web? The technology, of course, is critical. It's a critical element of it. But it's not the only thing that is needed at this stage. We need to, of course, use the technology, but see how this technology can be used to its full potential. And for that, we do need that multi-stakeholder dialogue. At the level of the WTO, what I'm trying to do, because I was struck when I was doing my research and saw that there were so many people working on this issue, but completely in silo. So what I'm trying to do is to actually bring them all together. And so I'm working with the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris to put in place a global platform where we would have representatives of the private sector from the different fields that are relevant for international trade, trade finance, transportation, logistics, governments, customs officers, etc. So governments, of course, and the series of international organizations you saw, so that we can have altogether a dialogue and move in the same direction. So stay tuned, the platform will be launched very shortly, in a couple of weeks or so. And the hope is to try and work, as I said, in the same direction. And I would like to finish this quote, this presentation by a quote by Henry Ford that I liked very much, because I think it should serve as an inspiration to all of us. Coming together is the beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. So I hope that we will all work together to make blockchain a success. Thank you very much for your attention.